The restaurant buzzed with soft chatter, the clinking of glasses, and the occasional laugh. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the elegantly dressed diners, their tailored suits and designer dresses complementing the lavish decor. Amid the sophistication, the door opened, and Margaret stepped in. Her modest, worn clothing stood out starkly against the luxurious setting. She clutched a small handbag tightly, her movements hesitant but dignified. Heads turned as Margaret approached the host's stand, her presence drawing glances filled with curiosity and quiet disdain. Whispers rippled through the room, diners exchanging looks as if silently questioning her place in such an establishment. Margaret's voice was soft but steady as she addressed the host. "Table for one, please," she said with a polite smile, her eyes scanning the room briefly. Before the host could respond, Karen, a waitress with a practiced yet insincere smile, stepped forward. She held a menu in one hand, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against it rhythmically. Her gaze swept over Margaret from head to toe, her judgment clear in her eyes. "Good evening," Karen said, her tone sweet but laced with condescension. "Are you sure you're looking for a table here?" Margaret's smile faltered slightly, but she nodded politely. "Yes, I'd like to have dinner, please." Karen hesitated for a moment before gesturing toward the back of the restaurant, her expression barely hiding her disdain. "Right this way," she said, her smile tightening as she led Margaret to a small, dimly lit table near the kitchen doors. As Margaret followed, the whispers and glances continued, the tension in the room palpable. Unaware of the storm brewing around her, Margaret quietly took her seat, her hands resting lightly on the table. Little did she know, this visit would soon unravel truths that would leave everyone stunned. Karen stood near the host's stand, watching Margaret with thinly veiled annoyance. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished floor as she approached the elderly woman, her forced smile barely concealing her disdain. "Ma'am," Karen began, her tone dripping with condescension, "are you sure you're in the right place? This isn't exactly affordable." Margaret looked up at her, her expression calm and kind. She nodded politely, ignoring the jab. "Yes, I'd like a table by the window, please," Margaret replied, her voice soft but steady. Karen blinked, caught off guard by Margaret's unwavering politeness. Her lips curled into a tight, sarcastic smile as she gestured toward the main dining area. "We're fully booked," she said, glancing at the empty tables near the windows. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere. Casual." Margaret's smile didn't waver as she clasped her hands together. "I'll wait if I have to," she said gently. Karen's expression faltered for a moment before she straightened up, her patience visibly thinning. She opened her mouth to argue, but a quiet voice interrupted. "I can seat her," a young busboy said, stepping forward cautiously. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, and he carried a stack of napkins under one arm. He avoided Karen's sharp glare and gestured toward a small table tucked into a corner near the kitchen doors. Karen crossed her arms, clearly displeased, but she didn't protest. The busboy led Margaret to the table, pulling out a chair for her with a respectful nod. Margaret smiled warmly at him. "Thank you, young man," she said as she settled into her seat. "Of course, ma'am," he replied, before retreating quickly to avoid Karen's wrath. Karen approached Margaret's table moments later, a menu in hand. Her movements were deliberately slow, her expression one of exaggerated boredom. When she finally reached the table, she slapped the menu down in front of Margaret, rolling her eyes. "Here you go," she said, her voice mocking, "though I doubt there's anything here in your price range." Margaret's hands paused on the menu, but her expression remained calm. She looked up at Karen with a small, composed smile. "Thank you," she said simply. Karen's smirk faded slightly as she turned on her heel and walked away, muttering under her breath. Margaret opened the menu and scanned it carefully, her movements unhurried. The tension in the air was palpable, with nearby diners sneaking glances at the exchange. their whispers barely audible over the ambient noise. After several minutes, Karen returned, tapping her notepad with a pen. "Have you decided yet?" she asked flatly, her tone impatient. "Yes," Margaret said, closing the menu and handing it back to Karen. "I'll have the house salad and a cup of tea, please." Karen raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed with the modest order. She scribbled it down without looking up. "Fine, I'll get that started," she said, walking away without another word. Margaret folded her hands in her lap, her serene demeanor unshaken by the disrespect. As Karen passed by the other tables, the whispers grew louder. A few diners exchanged disapproving glances, but no one spoke up. The busboy, who had been quietly observing, from a distance, frowned as he noticed Karen deliberately taking her time to process Margaret's order. When Karen finally returned with the tea, she placed it on the table with a loud clink, spilling a little onto the saucer. She didn't apologize as she set down the salad plate with a similarly careless gesture. "Enjoy," she said sarcastically before walking away. Margaret looked at the spilled tea and then at the busboy who was hovering nearby. He quickly stepped in, grabbing a napkin and cleaning up the mess with an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry about that, ma'am," he said softly. "It's quite all right," Margaret replied kindly. She took a sip of the tea and began eating, her quiet dignity contrasting starkly with Karen's rudeness. Unbeknownst to the staff and diners, Margaret's visit to the restaurant was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would leave everyone questioning their assumptions. Margaret sat quietly, savoring her modest meal while trying to ignore the pointed glances and whispers from Karen and the other staff. The room buzzed softly with chatter, but Karen's voice cut through like an unwelcome disturbance. "I don't know why we let people like her in," Karen whispered loudly to a fellow waitress near the counter, making no effort to lower her voice. She nodded toward Margaret, her lips curling into a smirk. "She's probably not even going to tip." The other waitress looked uncomfortable, her gaze darting nervously toward Margaret, who had clearly overheard the comment. Margaret's hands paused briefly, her fork hovering over her plate, but she didn't look up. Her expression remained calm, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of pain. She resumed eating, her movements slow and deliberate. Karen, emboldened by her own snide remarks, continued to gossip as she prepared drinks for another table. A few diners nearby exchanged disapproving glances, but none of them said anything. Margaret, meanwhile, remained composed, her quiet dignity unshaken despite the whispers echoing around her. After finishing her salad, Margaret raised her hand gently to catch Karen's attention. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said politely. "Could I please have a glass of water?" Karen turned slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly. With an exaggerated sigh, she grabbed a glass from the counter and filled it halfway with water. She walked toward Margaret's table, her movements deliberately slow and dismissive. When Karen reached the table, she leaned over and placed the glass down with an unnecessarily rough motion. The water sloshed over the rim, spilling onto the table and dripping onto Margaret's lap. Karen straightened up, her expression feigning innocence, though her smirk betrayed her true intentions. "Oops," Karen said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Sorry about that." Margaret looked down at the spilled water soaking into the tablecloth and her skirt. She took a deep breath, her calm demeanor intact as she reached for the napkin. Her voice was soft and measured as she replied, "It's okay. Accidents happen." Karen crossed her arms, her smirk growing more pronounced. "Oh, sure," she said mockingly. "I'll get someone to clean that up." She walked away without another word, leaving Margaret to quietly dab at the mess with her napkin. The busboy, who had been watching the scene unfold, quickly stepped in with a towel and a fresh glass of water. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice filled with genuine remorse. "Let me take care of that for you." "Thank you." Margaret said softly, offering him a warm smile despite the humiliation she had just endured. The other diners, who had been observing the incident, began murmuring among themselves. A woman seated at a nearby table leaned over to her companion and whispered, "That waitress is completely out of line. Someone should say something." "It's disgraceful," another diner muttered under his breath, shaking his head as he watched Karen return to the counter with an air of smug satisfaction. Margaret, though visibly pained, maintained her composure. She finished her meal quietly, her movements graceful and unhurried. The busboy returned with a fresh tablecloth and carefully replaced the soiled one, his kindness a stark contrast to Karen's rudeness. Margaret thanked him again, her gentle tone masking the hurt she felt. As Karen continued her shift, her pointed glances and occasional sarcastic remarks did not go unnoticed. The room was now charged with an undercurrent of tension, the diners increasingly uneasy with the blatant disrespect being shown to Margaret. Yet, Margaret remained a picture of quiet strength, her silence speaking volumes about her character. The incident had planted seeds of discomfort among the staff and patrons alike. While Karen carried on as though her behavior was justified, others began to feel the weight of what they had witnessed. Margaret's calm grace in the face of humiliation had left an impression, one that would soon grow into something far more significant. The restaurant's front door swung open, and a tall, confident man in a tailored suit stepped inside. David, the CEO of the restaurant chain, exuded an air of authority as he scanned the room. The staff immediately snapped to attention, their casual chatter replaced by hurried movements and whispered warnings to each other. "It's Mr. David," one server muttered, straightening their uniform. Karen, catching sight of him, quickly smoothed her apron and plastered on a bright smile. She strode toward him, her demeanor suddenly professional and eager to impress. "Welcome, sir," Karen said warmly, extending her hand. "You'll be happy to know we've been maintaining the highest standards here. Everything is running smoothly." David nodded politely, his eyes sweeping the restaurant. Karen seized the opportunity to continue, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "In fact," she said with a smirk, tilting her head toward the corner table, "we've been keeping the riffraff out. There's someone here I was just about to deal with." She gestured toward Margaret, who sat quietly in her corner, sipping her tea. Karen's smirk widened as she added, "I'm sure she doesn't belong here." David's gaze followed Karen's pointed finger, but as his eyes landed on Margaret, his expression shifted instantly. The confident smile vanished, replaced by a look of shock and recognition. Without a word, he walked briskly toward Margaret, leaving Karen frozen in confusion. "Mom?" David exclaimed, his voice filled with warmth and disbelief as he reached Margaret's table. He bent down, wrapping her in a warm embrace. "What are you doing here?" The room fell silent. The staff exchanged wide-eyed glances, and the diners paused mid-conversation to watch the unexpected scene unfold. Karen stood rooted to the spot, her face draining of color as realization hit her like a thunderbolt. She blinked rapidly, trying to process what she was seeing. Margaret smiled softly, patting David's arm as he straightened up. "I just wanted to stop by and see how things were going," she said gently. "But I didn't want to make a fuss." David turned, his sharp eyes locking onto Karen, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. His voice, calm but laced with disapproval, cut through the silence. "Karen," he said firmly, "is this how you've been treating my mother?" Karen stammered, her confident facade completely shattered. I didn't know, sir," she managed to say, her voice trembling. "I had no idea she was your mother." "That's the point," David said coldly, his tone leaving no room for excuses. "You didn't bother to treat her, or anyone else, I imagine, with the respect they deserve. And now, you've embarrassed yourself and this restaurant." Karen's eyes darted around the room, meeting the judgmental stares of the staff and diners. Her smirk was long gone, replaced by a look of sheer humiliation. David turned back to Margaret, his expression softening as he addressed her. "Mom, I'm so sorry for the way you've been treated here. You deserve better." "It's all right, David," Margaret said with a small smile. "The kindness of some people has made up for the rudeness of others." David nodded, glancing at the busboy who had stepped forward earlier to assist Margaret. He gave the young man an approving look. "Thank you for looking after her," he said. "I'll make sure your efforts don't go unnoticed." The busboy beamed, his earlier nervousness replaced by pride. Meanwhile, Karen stood off to the side, her face pale and her hands trembling as she avoided David's gaze. The weight of her actions hung heavily in the air, and she knew there was no recovering from this moment. The diners, who had been watching intently, began to murmur among themselves, their voices a mix of surprise and satisfaction. Margaret, as calm and graceful as ever, picked up her teacup and took a sip, her quiet dignity speaking louder than any words could. David stood in front of Karen, his expression hard and unwavering. The room was deathly silent, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. Karen's face was pale, her confident demeanor long gone as she stared at her boss, unable to find the words to defend herself. "Is this how you treat our guests?" David asked, his voice rising with controlled anger. His sharp tone echoed through the restaurant, making everyone freeze in place. "This woman is my mother," Karen stammered, her voice trembling as she tried to form an excuse. I didn't know, sir. She didn't look like—" David's eyes narrowed as he interrupted her, his tone cutting through her weak justification. "Exactly," he snapped. "You judged her based on how she looked. You made assumptions and treated her like she was beneath you. That is not only unprofessional, but also completely unacceptable." Karen's eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but all she found were the disapproving stares of her colleagues and the diners. She swallowed hard, her hands fidgeting nervously as David's words bore down on her. "We pride ourselves on treating every guest with respect and dignity," David continued, his voice unwavering. "You've embarrassed this establishment, disrespected my mother, and shown a complete lack of the values we stand for." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but quickly shut it when David raised a hand to stop her. "There's nothing you can say to justify your behavior," he said firmly. "You're fired. Effective immediately." The words hit Karen like a blow, and she visibly flinched. Her mouth opened and closed as if she wanted to argue, but no sound came out. Finally, she lowered her head, her face flushed with shame. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the back of the restaurant to gather her things, the weight of her downfall pressing heavily on her shoulders. As Karen disappeared into the kitchen, the staff began to step forward, their expressions filled with regret. One by one, they approached Margaret, their voices soft and apologetic. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry for the way you were treated," said one waitress, her eyes downcast. "It wasn't right, and we should have stepped in." "Please accept our apologies," added another, wringing their hands nervously. "We'll make sure this never happens again." Margaret looked at each of them, her kind eyes filled with understanding. She offered them a small smile, her voice gentle as she replied. "Thank you for your apologies," she said. "I hope this is a lesson for everyone here. Never judge someone by how they look. Kindness should be given freely, no matter who's sitting at the table." The staff nodded, their expressions filled with both relief and shame. The young busboy, who had been the only one to treat Margaret with respect from the start, approached her last. He stood awkwardly, clutching his towel, and spoke hesitantly. "Ma'am, if you ever come back, I promise I'll make sure you're treated like royalty," he said earnestly. Margaret chuckled softly, patting his arm. "You've already done more than enough, young man. Thank you for your kindness." David, who had been watching the interactions, turned to the staff with a firm expression. "Let this be a reminder to all of you," he said. "We treat every guest with respect, no matter who they are or what they look like. This restaurant is a reflection of our values, and there's no room for discrimination here." The staff murmured their agreement, their heads nodding in unison. The diners, who had been watching the drama unfold, broke into quiet applause, their approval evident. Margaret looked around, her calm dignity shining through as she acknowledged the kind gestures with a nod. As the situation settled, David turned back to his mother, his face softening. "Mom, I'm so sorry for what happened today," he said. "This shouldn't have happened, and I promise it won't happen again." "It's all right, David," Margaret replied, her voice steady. "You handled it well, and maybe it was good for them to learn this lesson." David smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as he guided her toward the door. "Let me take you somewhere better for dessert," he said with a grin. Margaret chuckled as they exited the restaurant, leaving behind a room full of humbled staff and patrons who would remember this day and its lesson for a long time. As the tense atmosphere began to settle, Margaret stood from her chair, her graceful demeanor undisturbed by the events of the day. She placed her hands gently on David's arm, her kind eyes meeting his with quiet resolve. "She made a mistake, David," Margaret said softly, her voice calm and forgiving. "Forgive her, but make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. No one should be treated the way I was today." David sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he looked at his mother with admiration. Her unwavering kindness, even in the face of such disrespect, was a testament to her character. "You're too kind, Mom," he said, shaking his head. "But I promise you, this won't happen again. I'll make sure our staff gets better training, and I'll personally oversee it. Respect will be at the heart of everything we do moving forward." Margaret nodded approvingly, her warm smile returning. She glanced around the room, her gaze settling on the staff members who stood silently, their faces marked with guilt and reflection. The weight of their actions was evident as they avoided her eyes, shifting uncomfortably under her gaze. Turning back to David, Margaret patted his arm gently. "Let's go," she said. "The lesson has been learned." David guided her toward the door, his protective hand resting on her shoulder. As they walked through the dining room, the staff watched them in silence, their expressions a mix of regret and newfound understanding. The busboy, who had shown Margaret kindness throughout the ordeal, stood by the kitchen door, giving her a small nod of respect. Margaret returned it with a smile, her gentle nature shining through even in her departure. The diners, too, observed quietly, their earlier curiosity replaced by admiration for the poised woman who had handled the situation with such dignity. A few whispered among themselves, their voices tinged with approval and acknowledgement of the valuable lesson they had witnessed. As Margaret and David exited the restaurant, the camera lingered on the staff, their somber faces reflecting on their actions. The room felt heavier, not with tension but with the weight of the changes that were sure to come. Karen's absence was palpable, a reminder of the consequences of letting judgment cloud one's actions.